Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here to have these distinguished and accomplished panelists to talk about the new energy paradigm. We're here at an important juncture in history. We're here to frame the next century of energy. And how we do this at a moment when we have the challenges we have of climate change, of energy security, of affordability and economic development, what's known as the classic energy trilemma, or the three-legged stool of energy. This, I think, we've lived through in the last couple of years, every dimension of this, of the tensions and trade-offs that are involved. We have seen in a way that we hadn't for a number of years. We were lulled into a certain kind of complacency in thinking that energy will always be available, effortless, free. Energy security was forgotten. We've been reminded through Europe's energy crisis, for example, through some of the challenges that we've encountered along the way with climate change and its worsening, that this is a complicated system and the parts connect to each other, right? And so how do we deal with this? You cannot simply optimize for one variable. We have to have systems thinking in how we think about the energy transition. And that's something that I encourage in our writings at The Economist, and I'm delighted to know that we have three powerful thinkers who are actually doing this in practice. I want to turn first to Marco. Marco, your company, Aqua Power, has made very large investments and bets on the future of new energy technologies. Green hydrogen, one of them, the NEOM project in Saudi Arabia is a showpiece. But this is a time when we are calling here at COP for ambition, for a tripling of clean energy technologies, for a doubling of efficiency. The IEA has called for an increase in energy investment to the tune of $4.5 trillion per annum, much of it for the developing world by the end of this decade. So this is a time of increased ambition, but we're also feeling the headwinds of high interest rates. The end of free money is over, if I may be so bold as to say. How are you able to think about ambitious projects like the ones you're working on in a more challenging financial environment?
Yeah, well, certainly you touch a very important point, particularly as I start to talk about a quadrilemma, so we need to add the speed to the other.
It was already hard enough with the trilemma, Marco. You're taking us to the next level now. Speed, okay, tell us more.
I mean, it's easy to make 200 megawatt a year. We'll never save the world. We'll never get there. So we need to really move to gigawatt or terawatt of energy installed every year. So what I see at Aqua Power with the model that we operate in, there is project financing. So that means that basically for every dollar that we invest, we mobilize 10 to 12 between the debt and the equity partner that we bring. So I consider ourselves really as a catalyst, first of the ingenuity, bringing the technologies and the solution, the design to do the projects, and the second is how you finance it. And that's basically our role in the energy transition for a company that works in the global south mostly. So besides, we're headquartered in Saudi Arabia, we're very active here in the Emirates, but we work largely in Africa and Southeast Asia, in Central Asia, so developing world. I always try to see what's making a country successful in this, and I always see that there's three ingredients. So the first one is there's a leader with a vision, clear vision. The second is a dialogue with investors, because each one needs to attain something. The investor needs to have reassurance that the capital will be repaid over time. And of course, the country needs affordability, security, sustainability, and speed. And the third one is quick decisions when this is done. So that's what we're trying to do, and sometimes we're successful, other times we're less successful. That's what drove me to think, what can we do more? And that is particularly on the financing side. The technology we can pull together, it's there. We're building renewables not out of ideology, but because it's the fastest, the simplest, and the cheapest technology that you can deploy. So it's really a matter of how do you finance it in some of these countries where maybe the population is twice the size of Saudi Arabia, but then the total installed capacity today is maybe the size of one plant that we do in Saudi Arabia every year. And that brings me to creative solutions. So the first one is the experience we've had in Central Asia, DFI, so the Development Financing Institution, can play an extremely great role and positive role in bringing everything together and accepting a role that is to guarantee a little bit the investments of the others together with the country, together with the state. Sometimes, however, we see DFIs who are not able to take a 20, 25-year view on the country. And I say, if they cannot, how can I, as a private investor, do that? The second avenue that we try is the partners on the equity. So I went out, I come from Europe, and a lot of people there proclaim themselves, we want to save the environment. Say, fine, we're building a lot of plants in the global south. Would you like to partner with us on the equity, to the long-term patient capital, insurance companies, pension fund? Say, no, sorry, we don't do non-OECD. And I say, well, then you're saving OECD, maybe. The third one I tried to go to, I sat on the board of, the advisory board of an impact investment fund, which was great. You say, I don't want, it was literally how they explain it to me, how it works. We say, we want simply return of capital. We don't want to earn a margin on that. I say, fine, I have a lot of debt. No, but we'd rather go for the small projects, that have the narrative. So you're helping 1,000, 10,000 people if you're very successful, because it's all about customer acquisition, these small projects. Why don't you work with companies like Aqua Power, like Masdar? We are a big catalyst. So you can bring all this together. Today, there's about $2 trillion a year of philanthropy around the world. Take a little piece of that. Use it for concessional financing for infrastructure projects that companies like us can build. It's not money going to us. It's money going to reduce the tariff and the cost of project for the population in these countries. And that is also something that I don't see happening very fast. So the last one is green hydrogen. Green hydrogen, the first project we developed, is under construction now in Saudi Arabia with our partners, Air Products and NEOM. So that is kind of like develop world to develop world. Maybe it's not the best example, but the second one is in Uzbekistan. And we broke ground last Monday, by the way, on this second project. And we're developing more projects across the belt, let me say, that goes from Morocco to Indonesia and down to South Africa. So really in this world. And I think that this can be a way to also provide an acceleration of development of infrastructure, particularly energy and desalination in these countries, because basically if you're coming with an investment that is installing 4 gigawatt, 5 gigawatt, 6 gigawatt in a country that has an installed capacity of 1 or 2, then you're bringing the scale that helps to bring down the cost, also to do much more around the project that we're developing. And we see that this is a channel because the demand will largely be in the developed country as a way to bridge the north, the global north, with the global south.
So you've given us a great overview. I wanted to pick up on the last piece of your puzzle where you talked about green hydrogen in that example. The green hydrogen that you make in Saudi Arabia at NEOM or in your other future projects, there isn't immediate demand in the vicinity. The plan, I believe, is for a global trade, perhaps as ammonia or some other derivative, but nevertheless, the idea is to engage in that kind of trade. We are in a moment, though, where a golden age of globalization seems to be threatened, with the backlash, with industrial policy, protectionism. Is there a concern when we think about energy, which has historically, in the last 100 years, been one of free flows of energy, particularly from this part of the world to other parts of the world? Are you concerned at all that some of the protectionism that we're seeing could actually affect the development of these new markets?
In fact, quite the opposite, because I think the European Union is putting up the carbon border adjustment mechanism, and that's going to force a lot of the developing countries to decarbonize. I was recently in Central Asia on countries where 95% of their exports are carbon intensive. So they will need to do something about their coal generation, and that's what we are helping them to do. One way certainly is generation for the production of final products that get exported. The second is green hydrogen and green ammonia. So I think that today the cost of production that we have in, let me say, the area where we have a lot of sun and a lot of wind and a lot of land here, let me say in MENA particularly, is more or less at the level where customers in developed countries are willing to accept it, considering a green premium. And by the way, that's another discussion we should have. Is the final consumer ready to pay a premium? Because we've been through 20 years where first inflation went to zero, second interest rate went to zero, and third free money with COVID, fortunately, to save the economy and the social contract, but the energy transition does not come at a zero cost. So at the end, the final consumer, until we reach the efficiencies, need to accept that. So that's what we're discussing with off-takers, where I see that mostly it's not a matter, because there is a niche today who's willing to pay this premium. It's not a matter of price, but it's a matter of tenure, because it's a new technology. People say it will cost less. And so what do? I wait. But then you don't build a scale that helps accelerate the transition and bring the cost down. That's where we need to work on, so that we can bridge it and come to a solution for the new industry that is emerging.
That's great. Okay, so you put a couple of ideas on the table that we'll unpack in our conversation. I want to turn to Juliet next. Juliet, you've had the experience of building companies over the years, in addition to many other hats that you've worn. We just heard from Marco the idea of green premiums, consumers. You've had consumer-facing access as well. So maybe you can bring a little bit of this to the party. But the big question I want to ask you, particularly because you come from a renewables background and distributed energy background, we are here at a COP where there is the ambition to commit to a tripling of renewables capacity.
Yeah.
That's an official aspiration here. This is on the back of spectacular growth in solar particularly, but also wind in recent years. How realistic is this? What are the obstacles to achieving that kind of ambition and more, which we need if we're going to decarbonize the energy systems?
So thank you very much. One of the organisations I'm here representing at COP is the Energy Institute, and I've been president for 2 years nearly now. And one of the things that's been really exciting is we took over something called the BP Statistical Review, something that BP has been producing, which is the data on the energy sector worldwide for the last, I think it's 72 years.
I think everyone in energy knows the BP Statistical Review.
Yes.
Yes.
So it's now the Energy Institute Statistical Review.
Well, there you go.
There you go.
Yeah.
But one of the things that was really interesting, obviously, this year, having seen so much amazing growth in renewables, particularly solar, particularly coming from southern parts of the world, is that actually we're still just keeping up with ourselves. So I think renewables without hydrogen are just at about 7.5% of total energy demand. If you add, not hydrogen, hydro, if you add hydro in, we get to about 14%. So for me, it feels if we have really got an ambition of tripling that, the pace is just not fast enough right now. So we have to move much, much faster. And to be able to do that, what you then have to look at is what are the things that are getting in our way? What is going to be, obviously, we've had huge decreases in costs in renewables. I think solar is at sort of 90% discount to what it was sort of 10 years ago. The same, not dissimilar in wind. So these technologies are now some of the cheapest in the world, but we're still not moving fast enough right now. And so I kind of, there are many different blobs I think of. I think of them in sort of sections. But the three that come to mind for this discussion are, the first one is really the infrastructure. So we built the infrastructure in a high-carbon world. We built transmission, distribution, particularly in developed countries, with the idea that you would have large centralized power stations. I think sort of pre-1980s, the UK, for example, had 50 power stations. It now has over 1 million people, if not more, producing power. So you suddenly go...
So micropower has taken over.
Yeah, well, hydro, yeah. And so you go from a system that's got a big central sort of spine to it, to a system that's feeding in the other way. So we have a completely different transmission system requirement than we've ever had before. And that's going to take, it's going to take huge amounts of investment, because there are places, sort of the UK is my hometown, so I kind of know it best. But there are places in the UK you cannot connect new generation today. You just can't. There's not the capacity on the network. And that's partially because we spent 10 years procrastinating and not giving the licenses out to invest. But then if you kind of look further than that, if you look worldwide, we're still figuring out how you go from an old centralized system where the transmission grid looked at power stations to a decentralized system. And there was a discussion earlier on how do we get investment into grid. Digitization is going to be an important part of that. So thinking about how microgrids work. I saw a brilliant thing on LinkedIn recently on Parkinson's, a disease that is horrific in older people. And they'd used AI to send electrical signals to the brain to interrupt with the signals that the brain was sending to somebody's hand. So the guy who couldn't pick up a glass could pick up a glass. And that made me think, well, if we can do that with somebody's brain, surely we can do that with an energy network. So actually using AI and data to reprogram the way we use our energy networks so it can cope with these multiple inputs that aren't always going to be telling you, yes, I'm ready to produce. There's not a phone call going into somebody who's got a solar panel on their roof. It's going to be produced when there's sun out and there's no clouds and that person isn't using the power themselves. So we need an intelligent system that can unlock that. And one that will mean that we can use the system, the infrastructure we already have in play much more effectively. So essentially, there's a lot of infrastructure that's not full today, but we can't use it to its maximum capacity. And two, then when we're making investment, we come back to this idea of cost and the end retailer. If we actually use our systems better, potentially you could reduce costs. So actually, if you engage with the end consumer, I spent my life sort of building a business that was delivering to an end consumer. Engaging with the end consumer and helping them to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem can significantly reduce costs again. So your rate of return as an investor, one, you de-risk it, and two, you actually improve it. So that's one of my first key areas. I guess my second one is an emerging one, and I'm not sure how to kind of really frame it at the moment, but it feels that we are going to really stretch our supply chains. We are beginning to see that already. So one of the areas I sort of work in is the Crown Estate, leasing the seabed for offshore wind in the UK. And I think one of the challenges there is that we see things like wind turbines getting bigger and bigger. And so we went to the testing centre in the UK, and they have a large building where they test wind turbine blades, and it's now too short. So the turbine blades stick out the other end. And what that means is that as we continue to increase this infrastructure, that means that the capacity to build this at pace and reduce the cost is going to reduce. And at some point, we have to rethink, do we need bigger turbines or do we need cheaper turbines? And that means that you then go to a manufacturing level that looks completely different. And I think we need to have some more strategic thinking about supply chain and how we make sure it keeps up with this capacity that we're going to need. And then finally, we need brilliant people. So the skills gap in this sector, I think, is going to continue to increase. So right now in the UK, the capacity to train new engineers, new thinkers, new physicists, obviously I think they're really important, I am a physicist, there is a gap. So we do not have enough university places to train enough people to do this energy transition. And it's something that we need to, again, rethink. How are we training the people who are going to do our jobs tomorrow? Are we going into the schools? Are we going in at a lower level and actually starting to train people? Are we giving alternative routes into this marketplace, as well as our highly skilled people? I had the pleasure, I love teaching. I get the opportunity to teach occasionally, to teach on an MSc at Oxford on sustainable enterprise. And these students are amazing. I was very glad I didn't see their CVs before I had to give the lecture because they were slightly terrifying. But that particular course is oversubscribed by something like 100 times. So that means that we just haven't got the capacity to bring on more brilliant people that we need in this sector to really be able to transform. So those are my kind of 3 high-level pieces. And all of those, if we come back to the consumer, unless we fix them, feed into the long-term cost of delivering this energy transition at pace.
So those are some tough challenges you've laid out.
Yep.
Now, I want to pick up on the first point you laid out for that smart, distributed, multi-directional flow we can see from the grid, the aggregation of individuals. I wrote a book called Power to the People 20 years ago that made the case for decentralization, digitalization, and democratization of the energy systems. It's been a slow change coming, right? We're talking about new energy paradigm. There are a lot of powers of incumbency and legacy mindsets that sometimes get in the way, but also individuals. And I just wondered, as a follow-up question, we see one of the obstacles being a kind of NIMBY mindset, where individuals really don't want to see any new energy infrastructure. We could even call it bananas. Build absolutely nothing anywhere near anybody, right? It goes beyond NIMBY. And so if we want to empower individuals in this way to be participating as micro-consumers in these wonderful grids of the future, do we also need to ask individuals to allow us to build the infrastructure of the future? How do we do that?
So I live in a small village, and it's quite old-fashioned, and people sort of come from, there's probably a slightly older age group. And 20 years ago, when I first moved to the village, people would never talk about energy, okay? Energy was not something they went down to the local hall and talked about it. They talked about cakes or development or too many cars in the village. About 4 weeks ago, I went to a presentation, which was, there were about 5 or 6 householders who had completely transformed their homes themselves. And my next door neighbor, he used to be an actuary in the insurance industry. He is now a trader, a personal trader in power in his home. And I'm not saying that this is representative across the UK, but when you give individuals an access to a marketplace, and not everybody is going to sit there with their spreadsheet and trade power, I completely get that. But if you give them a reason why this is a benefit to them, and potentially how they can reduce their costs as a result of their behavior change, and an infrastructure play locally to them, then you engage them. And that is a big shift, I think. I think people are concerned about climate, but if you give them access to this market and show them the way that they can become economically active as well as ecologically active, then I think that's a massive shift that we can see.
We could see a great awakening,
Yeah.
which is very interesting. We're here to talk about the new energy paradigm, so that is a new paradigm. So thank you for that. Great. Let's turn to our patient final speaker, Mohammed. Here in our host country here for COP, Masdar is very much in the news as a company that has made a commitment to a dramatic expansion in its investments globally to 100 gigawatts. You'll be one of the world's biggest renewable energy companies, developers around the world. Already you're an important force, but this is the kind of ambition that this COP has set out for renewables and more. Can you give us a sense? Again, I started off with a little bit of a pessimistic note, that is the global headwinds. We are in a challenging financial environment globally with the kind of inflation and interest rates, with some of the supply chain challenges. Some could even argue some of the growing pains or growing pangs of an industry that's growing so fast. How do you think about this now that you've put your marker down for this extraordinary expansion that is being envisioned in an age when capital is not only no longer free, but you see skittish capital in capital markets? What's different about your approach?
Thank you, Vijay. First, let me say welcome to the United Arab Emirates. Welcome to COP28. Dubai, the beautiful city of Dubai, and of course, happy National Day for all of us.
Yes, 52,
it's
am I
our
right?
52nd National Day. A young country that has done a lot over the past 52 years. And we are a young company. We have done also a lot over the past 2 decades, 17 years. We started with a 10 megawatt in Abu Dhabi, in our own city, Masdar City, almost 16 years ago, when we inaugurated that 10 megawatt. And believe it or not, that 10 megawatt was the largest solar park, not only in the United Arab Emirates, but also in the Arab world and Africa. 3 weeks ago, we inaugurated a solar farm not so far away from Masdar City, which was 2,000 megawatts. Yeah. From 10 megawatt to 2,000 megawatt in 15 years.
Right.
But of course, that was not the only solar farm that the UAE has built. Here in Dubai, great demonstration is the Mohammed bin Rashid Solar Park that combines few interesting and exciting solutions when it comes to renewables. Photovoltaic, and of course, concentrated solar power. And our dear friend Marco and Aqua will be inaugurating the largest concentrated solar tower in the world with thermal storage. So our country has done a lot. Masdar has done a lot. And like you have said, we have an ambitious target of 100 gigawatt by 2030. And that target was established last year when we welcomed to our shareholding structure alongside Mubadala, which is one of the largest or global sovereign wealth funds here based in Abu Dhabi. We also welcomed Taqa and ADNOC, two energy giants, to our shareholding structure, which allowed us to strengthen our foundation when it comes to capital, because this is something that you have highlighted and reiterated several times. So what I would say for us as a long-term investor in the renewable energy sphere and clean technologies, we don't see, we are not short-sighted, in other words. Cyclical markets are there. They have been there. They will stay there. And we as Masdar, we don't just look at one cycle. We look at the long-term horizon. And while we see today more expensive or costly cost of debt, cost of capital, that will not change our ambitious, and it will not change our momentum. In fact, this year alone, we have doubled our capacity, just in 1 year. So when we look at 100 years, when the shareholders came in and told me, Muhammad, you have a mandate by the leadership for 100 gigawatt. In fact, the leadership wanted 200 gigawatt, but we convinced them that 100 gigawatt by 2030 will be sufficient enough, because that's an aggressive target by itself. I told them, I am happy for 100 gigawatt, and we will achieve 100 gigawatt before 2030 at Masdar. It's not easy. So we have signed off on tripling renewable energy. My chairman, Dr. Sultan Al-Jaber, current president of COP28, was one of the key players pushing forward for tripling renewable energy. And I know that a lot of institutions, a lot of companies, a lot of countries have signed off on this pledge. We have signed off on this pledge. I know that Masdar will triple renewable energy by 2030 for sure, at Masdar level.
Yes.
I know my country will triple renewable energy by 2030, for sure. So it's easier to triple renewable energy in certain countries. In fact, in my humble view, it is much easier to triple renewable energy in the global south than the global north.
Because the renewable endowment is there in such a strong way? The sun shines where they are?
Because you are starting from nothing.
Or the lack of legacy.
Lack of legacy.
Yeah.
Indeed.
But let me press you on this. You've given a great explanation of your shareholding structure, of your long-term nature of your investors, that explains the ambition that you're able to pursue. But I want to challenge you a little bit on the last point about the Global South being maybe a little bit easier. To give another perspective, I recently spoke with someone who is a very senior person at one of the world's largest investment funds, known to everyone in this room, making a huge push, big fund, trying to develop renewables around the world. Even has some development banks as partners, even is looking at some form of first dollar risk offloading to their partnerships. And he said, look, it's very difficult. They've deployed very little of the capital that they've set up. It's very hard for us to do projects in developing countries. There's operational risk, forex risk. Now, of course, there's interest rate risk. There's risk and there's perceived risk that we have to deal with, knowing counterparty risk, contract risk. And so this, again, world-class, massive institution trying to mobilize capital. from the private sector running into practical obstacles, and I think that'll be familiar to people in the private sector. What do you say to them, or what advice can you give so that others can emulate your success and have the confidence the global south is where we should invest? What do they need to know? What is this, again, very brilliant senior guy at one of the world's biggest funds, what's he missing?
He's not missing anything, and honestly, he's absolutely correct. You know, global south is full of risk. Our business is full of risk, you know. And honestly, most of these big funds, they don't operate in the global south because they don't have to operate. If you have $1, would you invest it in the US or the UK, or would you invest it in Tanzania and Kenya? Honestly, I mean, if I am a sophisticated investor and I don't want to assume a lot of risk, I will go to the US and the UK. It's a no-brainer, right?
Or I'll demand a lot more return, right? Risk-adjusted return.
Indeed, but again, if you have $1
Right.
and you have one option,
Sure.
if you have extra capital, is different. However, we don't see ourselves as a financial investor because we are not. We are a developer that makes a difference.
Yeah.
We want to change the world. We want to make a difference. We go to countries that renewable energy does not exist. We go to countries where policies, regulation does not exist. And yes, we work with these countries. We conduct awareness, we conduct workshops alongside with our partners, alongside with the World Bank, with the IFC, with the EBRDs, with African Development Bank, with companies like Aqua Power that Marco is running, you know? So yes, it is not easy, but like I said, for instance, you told me tripling renewable energy. I give you live examples because I'm not a professor like my dear friend here, okay? I'm a businessman, and I like to, you know, kick the ground and shovel. That's who I am. So let's talk about Central Asia. Global South, it's considered Global South, correct? Uzbekistan, over the past 5 years, tripled the renewables. Azerbaijan, now, definitely they will triple their renewables. Kazakhstan, the same thing. So, was it easy? It wasn't easy. But it's much easier if you work with the government, you structure a framework that allows bankability. Mitigate the risk. The risk will always remain there. There are tools to mitigate these risks. And absolutely, when we look at a country, when we look at a technology, when we look at a project, we calculate the risk-adjusted return. And every country has a different returns. Every technology has a different return. When I invest in CSP with thermal technology, I expect a higher return than plain vanilla photovoltaic. Absolutely, for sure. And obviously, with the interest rates going up, you will need to adjust your returns expectation. Otherwise, my sustainable and investment committee will not approve the transaction. Because in the end of the day, while we are trying to decarbonize the world and help our recipients in all countries, we are also an investor. We need to make money.
Right.
Sustainability, I always say, everybody's talking about sustainability. I think the main important aspect of sustainability is economic sustainability. If you are not economically viable, if you cannot sustain your economic life and viability, you will fail. And with your failure, you will have a ripple effect in every community that you function and you work at. However, you said you are a little bit pessimistic, started as pessimistic. I am always optimistic, but it is extremely difficult, and it's getting more difficult. You mentioned supply chain, absolutely supply chain.
Yeah.
Excess of capital, financing is more expensive. Geopolitics is becoming even more complicated to navigate, and it's gonna get even more complicated. But we are committed, we are determined, and like I said, I'm optimistic.
I'm going to stop you there because you've given us the right time to stop. And on a positive note of optimism, I want to thank my panel for their enthusiasm and for their practical advice on how to take on the new energy paradigm. So please, thank you. I invite you to come off stage, and I want to also introduce our next speaker. So I won't belabor this. Raj Shah, who is both a fellow New Yorker and good friend, but author of a fantastic new book, Big Bets, which I recommend to all of you, on how to think ambitiously about the future, and president of the Rockefeller Foundation. I invite Raj Shah to come to the stage. Please give him a nice round of applause.
Good. Hello, everybody. It's so good to be with you, and I appreciate that very kind introduction from my friend and someone I admire so much. Vijay, thank you. You're always lucky if you have written a book to have someone with Vijay's credibility and visibility out there telling people to acquire it, so I hope you will. It's called Big Bets, How Large-Scale Change Really Happens. And I wrote the book because, frankly, and following on the final comment we just heard from the CEO of Masdar, what an extraordinary leader. I wrote the book because I felt like in our current moment, it's too easy to be pessimistic. That whether it's social media influencing us and our kids or our parents, whether it's sort of the day-to-day rough and tumble of the politics of whichever country you're in, or whether it's sometimes the inherent pessimism we've started to adopt about our capacity to do global cooperative politics and projects correctly, with vision, with persistence, with a long-term time horizon, and with an absolute commitment to succeed. Sometimes folks get pessimistic these days. And I feel like I had a chance through a course of my career to witness others make big bets on the efforts to bring people together, public and private, in the United States. I'm American, across the political divide of Democrats and Republicans, and across the globe in the context of North and South, to take on big aspirations that have in fact changed the world dramatically. And whether you look at efforts to fight HIV/AIDS that have saved country after country and community after community, efforts to vaccinate children across this planet over 2 decades, vaccinating 1 billion kids and allowing 16 million children to live who otherwise would have perished, or efforts to fight pandemics, even though the fight against COVID was a difficult one. Not long ago, we fought the Ebola crisis in West Africa, and when the Centers for Disease Control expected 1.6 million cases and a few 100,000 in the United States, by the time my President Obama, made a big bet, deployed American troops for the first time in history to fight a disease. 30,000 cases later, only 2 in the United States, neither transmitted there. That was clearly a successful big bet. So the question we ask ourselves today at the Rockefeller Foundation, and frankly at this important gathering of business and philanthropy leaders, is, are there big bets that we can pursue together, public, private, north, south, left, right, in a way that can bring us together, align our aspirations around common goals, and create a framework where we can be in an alliance together for years or decades until we succeed? And frankly, the answer to me is absolutely. In fact, I wanted to thank the CEO of Masdar, because Masdar is joined and is helping to lead a big bet alliance I just left, which was called the Battery Energy Storage Solutions Alliance. That effort is bringing together nearly 20 countries that don't have access to basic energy storage technologies. Those countries are committing, 15 countries, are committing to projectize and acquire 5 gigawatts of energy storage. That 5 gigawatts will cost $4 billion, 3 of which will come from partners like Masdar, commercial, strategic, long-term investors, but $1 billion of which will have to be philanthropic. and grant money raised from development entities and climate finance providers. And that project will ultimately enable these 15 countries to take advantage of the extraordinary renewable potential they have in their nations, but address the fact that many of these countries, whether it's Barbados that has the capacity but not the ability to take on more intermittent power, or Kenya, which has the largest wind farm in East Africa sitting at 10 or 15% utilization because the grid can't take intermittent power, or Malawi, which wouldn't even try to bring on renewables on a very fragile and small grid system because they have no capacity to take intermittent power. Many of these countries are forced down the path of coal, heavy fuel oil, and backup diesel generation because it avoids the challenge of having to figure out how their grids can be set up for the power generation needs of the future. That one consortia, in my view, represents the best of what we're able to do when we use philanthropy as society's risk capital. When we say we're willing to dream big, put our resources at play, and just as important or more important than our resources, bring our technical capabilities and our networks as business and philanthropy leaders to a task that would otherwise just be left to governments. If the World Bank financed the 5 gigawatts of power and those countries went out and tendered and tried to procure that technology on their own, without collective action, without technical cooperation, without best-in-class systems analysis, without Google X helping us figure out how to visualize and build digital twins of systems so you could do the appropriate modeling, they would never have a chance to do the appropriate program design and to access the technology in a market that, frankly, we all know is competing with the global electric vehicle industry for basic commodities. So it is the power of collective action and the power of coming together across these different divisions that retains my optimism. It's why I wanted to hustle all the way over here by golf cart in order to be able to address you as business and philanthropic leaders. And it's why I want to leave you with the following challenge. 2 years ago, we partnered at the Rockefeller Foundation with the IKEA Foundation and the Bezos Earth Fund, and we launched the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet. Each of those partners committed $500 million. On top of that, a group of public institutions like the World Bank committed billions more. And today we are launching programs like this battery program with the resources and the alliance capabilities that makes possible. To happen and to be successful at making these big bets real, and I'm going to leave you with this, you all have to do 3 things really, really well. And every single day we continue to learn how to do these things in some tough settings and some relatively easier ones. The first is set big goals. Don't let us succumb to the incremental. If we do not transition and dramatically accelerate renewables deployment in 81 countries around the world, 75% of all global emissions in 2050 will come today from those nations. Don't kid yourself. It's not going to happen unless you get together, set big goals, and insist on moving ahead against a much bigger aspiration than the world has currently set for what we call the Global South, which is a framework. I'm not sure I love the terms, but you get the point. The second is working together in alliances and across unlikely partnerships, public and private. It would be very easy, and many of our partners would say, why would you go to a COP in a state that's referred to as a petro state, in a community where you're dealing with oil and gas partners? We're not going to use our philanthropic resources to extract fossil fuels and enable them to burn, but we are going to recognize that certain institutions, certain investment institutions, certain technical institutions, certain corporations, and certain countries have history, knowledge, capability, and technical strength. And we need everybody in this fight together. So public and private, where I come from, it's also left and right in politics, do the hard work and build those alliances. And finally, most importantly, and something I expect each of you to be excellent at, and so your excellence has to really transmit across the rest of the sector, especially here at COP, measure, measure, measure results. None of the projects I mentioned in health, none of the things we're doing right now in energy would have any chance of being successful if there wasn't real discipline around how to set targets, how to measure results, and how to collect data fast enough that you can make course corrections along the way. If we do these three things, we embrace the spirit of the last speaker from the last panel and stay optimistic, and we insist on walking out of Dubai and this extraordinarily important COP with our head held high and our absolute willingness to work with each other in business and philanthropy, I'm convinced we can be successful, and that allows me to be an optimist as well. Thank you.